For those of you that have your phones on, you can go ahead and pull out your calculator. And today I want to ask you a fast math question. What is 70 times 7? First one to get it will get something free.
490.
490, good job. 7 times 7 is the amount of times that Jesus has instructed us to forgive one another. And the quote that I want to go over today is a quote by Brennan Manning, and it reads as such: "The unwounded life bears no resemblance to the rabbi." The first time I heard this quote, I was reading a book called The Ragamuffin Gospel, which is basically just talking about how the grace of God has really been hyped up to include more of our works than it does His goodness, and undoes a lot of thoughts that talks about how we have to do in order to receive. So it's very important to me because when I spent time reading it, I was kind of in a mode of works myself. So the more that I read it, the more that those kind of mentalities were being unraveled, and it just really stuck out. And I come across a verse in John chapter 20 that's talked about Thomas after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, when the disciples show up to tell him, "Hey, we've seen Jesus." And we all know Thomas's response, which is where we get the term doubting Thomas from when he says, "I won't believe it unless I see the holes in his hand and I touch the wound in his side." Later on, it talks about how he was together with the disciples and they were in a room with the door locked, more than likely in fear because there were people that were hunting followers of Jesus post his crucifixion. Now, a few chapters before, Jesus had been threatened to be stoned to death in Jerusalem, so they flee. He decides with the disciples he wants to go back to Jerusalem, and they all say, "No, they're trying to kill you." But Thomas was the first one to say, "Let us go also that we may die with him if he dies." So it's odd to see the contrast between what we call doubting Thomas in chapter 20, who was zealous Thomas in the previous chapter. So what ends up happening is we see Thomas, with his unbelief, is a real indicator that he's hurt or he's been wounded. The problem is he had expectations of Jesus. He was looking for the eternal move of Jesus that he was talking about with the coming kingdom, and it did not come to pass the way that he thought it was going to be. So what ended up happening was he refused to believe that Jesus was around anymore or had come back after his crucifixion and resurrection, simply because while Jesus was there, he made all these promises and now he was gone. So he felt like Jesus had broken all the promises that he had just made to all of the disciples. So he decides that he's not going to believe it, but still, for whatever reason, is hanging out with the other disciples when they're in the room. And a lot of times what we end up doing ourselves is having promises from people or having plans that we made or things that we want to do that included other people or that were promised to us, and they get broken and we get upset, we get wounded, and we don't want anything to do with the person unless we see the change, right? We always say if they're upset, our response is, "I'll believe it when I see it." And Thomas was kind of in the same mode. He'd been hurt, so he wanted physical proof that what had happened had actually happened, that the change that he was expecting had actually occurred. So what we do is when we get wounded like that, we build walls. We build walls around our hearts, we build walls around our lives to keep ourselves from getting wounded again. And what it takes in order for us to get over the pain that we felt and the woundedness that we've gone through is a God who walks through walls. Later in the story, when they're there together, the disciples and Thomas, what it says is they're there together and suddenly Jesus appeared among them. He walked through the walls to get to Thomas to prove to him that he was indeed who he says he was. The same way we need somebody that can walk through walls to encourage us that they are who they are. And that's really kind of where that whole thing spoke to me from in that passage, was just a reminder to me that woundedness is Christ-like. That when we get hurt, we are blessed. That when we do things that kind of keep us away from other people because we don't want to get hurt again, that Jesus will walk through the walls that we've set up and really just establish himself in our lives. So thank you.